it has been a huge week in legal news. We have a ton to cover, and next week is going to be probably even bigger than this week, and that's saying something. So one of the things I want to cover today is Brian Kohberger, the man arrested for the Idaho student murders. I want to talk about the ancestry DNA issue. I want to talk about the Hyundai Elantra confusion too. I want to talk about Alec Baldwin. Boy, that's huge news for the week. The announcement that he is going to be prosecuted for involuntary manslaughter. I want to talk about Alec Murdaugh. The trial at long last starts next week. The jury is going to decide whether or not he murdered his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul. I want to talk a little bit about Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX and some inside legal drama that's going on in that case. Lawyer wars, if you will. And then I want to talk about the Chrisleys, who, as anyone following the channel knows, reported to prison this week. And so all of that is absolutely huge news. So as you can tell, I'm sort of still new to the whole live stream, but I'm going to be trying to block it out and show you where each of the sections start. So if you're really interested in one section, look down in the show notes below and you should be able to see exactly where to go in the stream so you can hear the talk about that particular case. So, and while I'm thinking about it, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to have you back, and hopefully with fewer technical difficulties next time. So let's get started. And I think I want to start with the Murdaugh murders. Now, the Murdaugh murders is already a huge case. Lots of people talking about it, documentaries, lots of stuff going on around the Murdaugh murders. I would call it one of the most interesting cases in America, and it starts next week. It's finally happening in Colleton County, South Carolina. This case has more twists and turns than a John Grisham novel. It revolves around an attorney, now disbarred, Alec Murdaugh. He comes from a well-respected family. He was a fourth-generation lawyer, and the generations before him were not just lawyers, they were actually prosecutors in the area. They were extremely well respected in the area. And so they had this long history of being respected, and he was born into and part of that family. But now he has been disbarred and he has been accused of absolutely heinous crimes, stealing money from his clients, draining the trust funds of his very own clients. And not just any clients, these were children of people who were killed in accidents or mentally disabled from accidents. And he stole from his own law firm, according to the allegations. That was founded by his own grandfather, his own great-grandfather, and his brother was one of the partners. He's also been charged with tax evasion. He's been charged of staging his own murder for insurance fraud purposes, drug trafficking. He's been accused of more crimes than many cartels are ever that charged of. But most sensational of all, he has been charged with murdering his own wife and son, Maggie and Paul, and of using two different guns to do it on the same night, within a matter of minutes of each other. He says he found them dead. The murder trial starts on Monday, and he is facing life in prison. Now, they are not seeking the death penalty, and in my view, I think it's because I think they have some weaknesses in their case. I think that's the reason they aren't seeking the death penalty. You know, they aren't announcing why they have made that decision, but that's my personal opinion. The motive, the prosecution was required to talk about what motive did it say? What motive did it believe was the reason that Murdaugh committed the murders, that he would murder his own wife and son? And here's what they said. I'm going to quote from it. The evidence will show Murdaugh accrued substantial debts over a period of years, and to uncover those debts, began engaging in illicit financial crimes. And that's been a huge allegation across the board. He's subject to numerous other lawsuits civilly. but the prosecution is using it in this case too. And they say the evidence will further show these financial crimes were about to come to light at the time of the killings, more specifically on the date of the killings. And what they're talking about is that in testimony in another trial of the banker who was accused of working with Murdaugh, in that trial, Murdaugh's former partner said she confronted him the day of the murder saying, "We believe you've been stealing from us. What do you have to say about that?" And he had to run off. His, I believe it's his father or mother had become ill, mother, I think. And he had to run off, left, but she had confronted him that very day. So here, I'll keep going with what the prosecution said. Ultimately, the murder served as Murdaugh's means to shift the focus away from himself and buy himself some additional time to try and prevent his financial crimes from being uncovered, which, if revealed, would have resulted in personal, legal, and financial ruin for Murdaugh. I'm going to tell you, I honestly am not impressed by that motive, by that as their motive. And so this is kind of my, but I'm also going to tell you that I think it's brilliant. I think it was brilliant of the prosecution to use it, and I don't think it's really strong for the murder case. And here's what I mean by that. So there is some support for it factually because, of course, the woman who was his former partner says, "I told him about it that day, that very day of the murders. I confronted him with stealing from our firm." And furthermore, his son, Paul, who was one of the two people murdered, was about to be tried for felony counts of boating under the influence when he was 19. He was by now 22 at the time he was murdered, and of killing a young woman while he was boating under the influence. Trial was about to start, and so there would be clear reason to believe that Alec Murdaugh was in fact worried about funds and upset. But I'm still not crazy about that being the motive for the murder. And the reason is this. I mean, murdering your wife and son to buy time and to shift focus away from yourself just seems awfully petty. I mean, they don't seem to be the same I if you were going to murder your wife and son, you would need a really good reason, and buying time seems like a poor reason. I just am not really impressed with that as a motive. I wonder if they won't come up with things that are a lot stronger when it comes time for the actual trial starting next week. But I also want to explain to you why that was really brilliant. You see, Alec Murdaugh wants to keep out evidence of his financial crimes. He wants to say, look, financial crimes over here, murder over here, they're different. If you want to prosecute me for murder, fine, but you can't muddy the waters. You can't bias the jury by trying to convince the jury that I am the kind of person who does bad things. You have to convince them that I killed Maggie and Paul on that day. And if you can't convince them of that, you can't use all this other stuff to kind of convince them I'm just a bad person. But here is what the state has done and why it was so brilliant. The state made a reason for the financial information to come in. Now the state is saying the reason for the murders was the financial crimes and the fear of exposure of the financial crimes. So that was really, it was a brilliant move. I just don't think it's a great motive. And I think they'll have to come up with more at trial to convince a jury. And they may. I have no idea what evidence they're going to present, but I will be following that trial very closely because it is quite, and it is a sensational case with every possible thing under the sun included. It is really going to be a fascinating trial. So now I want to turn and talk a little bit about Brian Kohberger, about the Idaho murders and about what's going on in those cases. You'll remember that the 4 Idaho students were murdered, all knifed to death in their beds while they slept. And I want to talk about a couple of issues that have really been sort of brewing around the internet this week. The first is the problem of the Hyundai Elantra. You may remember that on November 29th, we'll step back a little bit. There was a statement that was issued by the police when it was time for them to bring Brian Kohberger in and to show the cause that they had, the probable cause that they had, they came up with a statement, a 19-page statement, very lengthy, very detailed about what they had done. And in that statement, they said on November 9th, that an officer looking through the files for a white Hyundai Elantra found Kohberger's and noted it and considered it because they were already looking for a white Hyundai Elantra on November 29th. So we know that much. But then there was also, and they were pretty detailed about it. At approximately 12:28 a.m. on November 29th, 2022, Washington State University police officer Daniel Tiengo queried white Elantras registered at Washington University. As a result of that query, he located a 2015 white Elantra with a Pennsylvania license plate. So all of that led to some suspicion around Bryan Kohberger, but just how much? Because after that, on December 7th, the Moscow police put out a press release asking for people to provide information, anything they had found out about or heard about for a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra. But remember, Bryan Kohberger's Hyundai Elantra is a 2015. It's not a 2011 to 2013. So questions on the internet have arisen. Well, why the mismatch? Because remember, they'd already alerted to Bryan's Hyundai Elantra, and here on December 7th, they put out a press release stating that they want specifically to find 2011 to 13, which doesn't include the model year of his vehicle. So I saw some speculation. Well, maybe they did that intentionally to throw Kohberger off the trail, to make him feel secure, like he didn't have anything to worry about. I think that would not have been worth it from the government standpoint. I don't think that could be it. And here's why. It's awfully close. If I were Bryan Kohberger and I had committed a murder in a 2015 Hyundai Elantra, and I now learn that 2011 to 13 is the years they're working for, I don't feel reassured. I still feel nervous because that's kind of close. And it seems like they're maybe on the right track. So I would be worried. So I would think if the police wanted to make him feel secure, they would just not do the press release at all. They wouldn't ask people for information about the Hyundai Elantra. They would just keep it quiet, and they would not put out information that's close, but just a little bit off. That's just my thought. I also think that it's difficult from an attorney's point of view because it's kind of egg on the government's face and on the face of the expert. This is what they said in the affidavit. The forensic examiner, and this is the Kohberger statement that I talked about, the forensic examiner initially believed that suspect vehicle 1 was a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra. Upon further review, he indicated it could also be a 2011 to 2016 Hyundai Elantra. As a result, investigators have been reviewing information on persons in possession of a vehicle that is a 2011 to 2016 white Hyundai Elantra. The problem is when you have to go back to the expert and he has to change his mind about what he did, it looks sloppy. It makes him look inexpert, not expert, but inexpert. And that's a tough admission to make. I mean, it gives the defense something to talk about. So I don't think that they would have done that on purpose. That's just my thinking. I don't think it would have been intentional. So then there was talk about, well, didn't they maybe suspect Kohberger and then came to find out about this? Maybe, but why did you not suspect Kohberger? I mean, if you knew he had a Hyundai Elantra and what made you dismiss him as a potential suspect? Again, it gives the defense something to talk about. They'll say, well, the law enforcement thought the only reason they think he's the one is this Hyundai Elantra, and that's pretty unreliable evidence. They're obviously going to come up with much more evidence, at least I would think so. They're going to have all sorts of evidence from the scene. They've now been to his apartment. They've got his car. So you would think they're going to come up with a body of evidence. But that's just the kind of thing I think lawyers would be thinking about and talking about. So, and then there comes the question, okay, well, what made you change your mind and think it was Kohberger? And this is where the new theory may fit in. You may have seen a bunch of articles out on the internet about ancestry DNA testing. Now, the Idaho Statesman and some other news outlets are reporting that Brian Kohberger told a neighbor that he had done ancestry testing. Now, I'm talking about things like ancestry.com or other databases where you send off your DNA and get some results. This is not mentioned in the probable cause statement. There's no word about this. But it's a fascinating issue. This is actually a societal issue. There is reason to think twice before doing DNA testing if it's going to be used to incriminate people, right? Society has to consider, what do we think this is for? What do we think its purpose is? Because potentially by sending that off, you could be incriminating yourself or someone in your family. For example, your sister sends off DNA and your son is incriminated, or your brother is incriminated. So a fascinating question comes up. Do we care? As a society, do we care? I mean, is our view that this is totally fine because the person committed a crime? Or are we worried that governments will use it for other reasons other than crime? And the idea, the concept that the government gets to use this personal data is scary. So I would be really interested in your opinion. And you could just put a quick something in the comments quickly that just says, crime, meaning that you think, hey, it's a crime. I'm okay with them using ancestry DNA or any other kind of testing. That's all right. It's a crime. Or private. And by that, you mean DNA testing that you send off for private reasons shouldn't be used by the government for any purpose, including tracking criminals. And I'd be curious what you think. So if you would put that in the comments, and while I'm thinking about it again, please be sure to like the video and subscribe. I want to see you back for more videos. Now I want to give you a little insider ballpark on some drama, legal drama that's going over in the Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX case. If you don't know about the FTX drama, trust me, you really want to. Sam Bankman-Fried was the understated but omnipresent founder of cryptocurrency exchange FTX. Now, when FTX came crashing down, he personally lost $16 billion, if you can even begin to imagine. Bloomberg calls it one of history's greatest ever destructions of wealth. But SBF, as he's called, is not the only one who lost money. The idea of FTX was that for most clients, there were two sets of clients, but for most, it was just supposed to hold your crypto. That's all it did, and it let you exchange it if you wanted to. You could exchange it for another type of crypto or for cash, whatever you wanted to do. But what happened, according to prosecutors, is instead Sam Bankman-Fried, known as SBF, and his cronies took your crypto and lent it to themselves, or lent it to another company they own, or just traded it without your permission. Billions of dollars worth of crypto are just missing, and FTX has declared bankruptcy. So now this week is lawyer wars in that case, because the U.S. trustee is asking to keep out one of the biggest firms in the United States, Sullivan and Cromwell. They're big silk stocking firm, lots of good reputation, but the U.S. bankruptcy trustee, Andrew Vera, is saying that they can't represent FTX because they represented FTX before the bankruptcy, and also because they've hidden some of their connections with FTX. They say, for example, that FTX's U.S. general counsel actually used to work for, was a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, had a close relationship with them. And they say, how can you possibly investigate if your former partner is one of the people you're investigating? So Sullivan and Cromwell is fighting to be able to stay in. And this is probably one of the only places where the U.S. trustee and Sam Bankman-Fried are aligned, because he is seriously upset with Sullivan and Cromwell. He says they strong-armed him, more or less forced him to get out, that they forced him to get out and turn the company over into bankruptcy and to give up control and leadership in the company. And he is very regretful of that. Then, if you've been following the channel, you know, and probably any news, that this week the Chrisleys, Todd and Julie Chrisley, reported for prison. Todd has been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, and Julie has been sentenced to 7 years. They were charged with and convicted of bank fraud and tax evasion. They also were ordered to pay $17 million in restitution. Now, it's not clear where that is in the process, but from an interview I heard with one of their lawyers, I don't think it's been paid. I think they're waiting for the appeal. But they asked for bond pending the appeal so they wouldn't have to show up for prison, and the judge said, no, you have to show up. So they had to actually report today, this week. Julie is at a federal prison in Kentucky. Todd is at a federal prison in Florida. Now, that's pretty tough on the family trying to visit them in 2 different states. Originally, they were both going to be in Florida, not really all that far apart. For reasons that weren't revealed, they switched Julie Chrisley to this Kentucky prison. Speculation was it has a hospital associated with it, and she's had cancer in the past. Maybe it was for that, or maybe it was just a lack of room at the Florida facility. So it's not really clear. Their appeal is still pending. They have 2 important grounds. They're 2 chief grounds, and I've done plenty of videos on all of this, so you can follow up and find out more about what they were charged with and what their appeal grounds are going to be. There are 2 main ones. The first is they say that the government used documents to convict them that it got in an illegal search of their warehouse. I heard their lawyer talking this week and saying that they showed up, the state of Georgia showed up with and claimed they had a warrant, and they didn't. And they took a bunch of documents, and that's sort of the start of the whole suit against the Chrisleys. The second thing they say is that a government witness from the IRS gave false testimony about whether they paid taxes for certain years. But I will say this, they may have an appeal, and those are stronger than normal grounds for an appeal, but winning an appeal is extremely difficult. The numbers of percentages are very, very low. So it's a long shot anytime, including here and including for the Chrisleys. I've got a ton of videos from this week on the effect on the Chrisley kids, whether the Chrisleys can make a comeback, what the charges were all about, whether they can win their appeal. Ton of videos. You can watch all kinds of stuff about them on the channel. So be sure to like and subscribe and check out some of these other videos. And then last but definitely not least, I want to get to the Alec Baldwin case. Now, the biggest legal news for this week has to be that the first judicial district attorney in Santa Fe, New Mexico, announced that she is going to be charging Alec Baldwin with involuntary manslaughter. So just a quick recap, you may already know about this. December 2nd, 2021, they were doing rehearsals for and filming for the movie Rust. They were on a set in New Mexico. Alec Baldwin's character is going to use a gun or carry a gun. To make it look realistic, they were using a real gun, but obviously it's supposed to be unloaded. The assistant director, David Halls, hands Baldwin a gun. Everybody thinks it's unloaded. I don't think there's any dispute about that. Alec Baldwin has the pistol pointed in the direction of the cinematographer, Helena Hutchins, who is giving him directions, and the gun goes off, kills her, and wounds the director, Joel Souza. Horrific, terrible event for everybody involved. Now, there are 3 people who are being charged or who have pled guilty. The first is the assistant director, David Halls, who handed Baldwin the gun. He has signed an agreement to plead guilty to negligent use of a deadly weapon, which is a petty misdemeanor under New Mexico statute 30-7-4. But 2 people are being charged with involuntary manslaughter. The first is Alec Baldwin, the actor who allegedly fired the gun, and second, the weapons specialist or armorer, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, who was in charge of the guns being used on the sets. Now, the New Mexico statute 30-2-3 says that involuntary manslaughter consists of manslaughter committed in the commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony, and focus on this part right here, or in the commission of a lawful act, which his was. He was lawfully in a movie. He was lawfully holding a gun as part of what he was doing. or in the commission of a lawful act, which might produce death in an unlawful manner or without due caution and circumspection. So they're each, both Hannah Gutierrez Reed and Alec Baldwin, they're each being charged with 2 different counts, according to the press release that was put out by the prosecutor. Both counts, though, oddly to me, related to Helena Hutchins' death, and neither relates to the injuries to the director, Joel Souza. So I don't know why that would be left out. I don't know why that would be so different, but they're only pursuing the actual death of Helena Hutchins. So, and they say we're going to do 2 different counts. We're going to plead them in the alternative. It hasn't happened yet, but they've announced that it will be, and that it will be done, I believe they said by the end of the month. The first one is involuntary manslaughter with underlying negligence. What could they get for that? They could get 18 months in jail and a $5,000 fine. The second one is involuntary manslaughter in the commission of a lawful act more than simple negligence. And this one is the more important one, because they're arguing that not only could you get could they get 18 months in jail and $5,000 fine, they also could get something called a firearm enhancement, which would add a mandatory 5 years in jail. That's the one with the bigger sting because it has so much more jail time attached to it. Now, the prosecutor is saying that that firearm enhancement is automatic underneath the offense of involuntary manslaughter. So in other words, if we manage to prove involuntary manslaughter, you automatically get the kicker since a gun was used. So that's what they're going to argue in their case. Now, Alec Baldwin's attorney said something real different. He said this is a terrible miscarriage of justice. He said the actor had no reason to believe there was a live bullet in the gun or anywhere on the movie set. He relied on the professionals with whom he worked who assured him the gun did not have live rounds. We will fight these charges and we will win. So what they're going to say is Baldwin did use due caution and circumspection. He was careful. He was as careful as he could be. How was he supposed to know it was loaded? He hired people to make sure it wasn't loaded, hired people to deal with all this, and did all he could. So that's clearly the argument that he's going to make. There are a bunch of huge questions out there that we may or may not ever get answers to. One is they found 500 rounds of ammunition at the movie set. Some were blank, some were dummy rounds, some were live rounds. Why? Why were some of them live rounds? That's something strange right there. And another question, was it necessary to have real guns loaded with blanks or dummy rounds? Could they have used something else? And in fact, there was talk about other movie sets, which before this and certainly after this have gone to just using special effects and forget the live gun and certainly forget any to ammunition on that. Another question is, who was responsible for checking this particular gun to see whether it was loaded? Because that should never have happened on the set. There should never have been a live gun on the set. And a question that the prosecution is going to ask is, did Alec Baldwin have a duty to check behind the people he hired to do the checking? And his attorney is going to say, absolutely not. He did all he could. The prosecution is going to say, yeah, he did. They're also going to argue, I would suspect, that Alec Baldwin had a higher duty because he was the producer. That made him kind of in charge. You may wonder, I did, why was Alec Baldwin pointing the gun at the cinematographer? Well, what he told George Stephanopoulos on an interview he did after the shooting was that Helena Hutchins was preparing to get just the right angle. She was standing beside the camera, and he was supposed to be pointing it there slightly off from the camera. Excuse me. And he said he was told specifically, this is a cold gun, meaning not loaded with live ammunition. He also claimed on the George Stephanopoulos interview that he never even shot the gun, that he just cocked it, and when he let go, it fired on his own. That has created a lot of question about whether or not he made that up, whether or not he's avoiding responsibility. I think that's just he doesn't really remember exactly what happened. I'm sure it was a traumatic event. I don't really see that as anything reflecting on his role in it or whether or not he should be convicted. So looking at the case, there are some problems for the prosecution, and I want to talk about what some of those are and what some of the problems for Baldwin are. Now, some of the problems for the prosecution are that New Mexico's Office of the Medical Investigator conducted an autopsy and looked at law enforcement reports and determined this was just an accident. That's all it was. That's a problem for the prosecution because it suggests that Baldwin wasn't at fault, Hannah Gutierrez Reed wasn't at fault. This is just an accident. That's all that it was. That's all that happened. It also suggests that the prosecutor may have a hard time proving that Baldwin didn't use what that statute called for, due caution and circumspection. There was also a ruling from the New Mexico Occupational Health and Safety Bureau. They fined Rust Movie Productions the maximum possible amount, which was $137,000. And they cited safety failures, and they said production managers took limited or no action to address 2 misfires of blank ammunition on the set prior to the fatal shooting. Now that can cut 2 different ways. On the one hand, there were already problems and everybody should have been alerted to that. On the other hand, they weren't pointing to Alec Baldwin. They were pointing to production managers. I don't know if Hannah Gutierrez Reed would fit under the category of what they meant by production managers, but I don't see how Alec Baldwin could. So that creates more problems for the prosecution. But there are also, of course, some problems for Baldwin that he's going to have to face. One is he was a producer. His defense to that he stated in the George Stephanopoulos interview was, I was just a producer who did casting and script. I mean, I wasn't a producer who oversaw the entire show. That wasn't my job or what I did. Then for Hannah Gutierrez, it was only her second film ever. And in an interview, she said she had not been ready on her first film. So that may be an issue that will come back to bite all of them, because they may argue she was inexperienced and should never have been hired to do the job as armorer and watching over all the guns. Her attorney also said she was stretched because she was hired for positions. That's a problem because, of course, the argument is going to be, you should have, instead of saving money by trying to use as many people for as many positions, or as few people for as many positions as possible, you should have hired people to truly handle this. It's an important issue, and you didn't full attention. Alec Baldwin did not help himself in that regard in the George Stephanopoulos interview, where he said, I assume everyone who is hired for a low budget film is stretched. So that won't particularly help. There was also a letter mailed the day of the shooting by Lane Looper, who resigned due to safety concerns. That'll be fleshed out in depositions and over the course of the trial. And then finally, Alec Baldwin said to Stephanopoulos, I would never point a gun at someone and pull the trigger. You don't point a gun at someone and pull the trigger. So again, that plays into his argument that all he did was cock the gun, and when he released it, it fired without him pulling the trigger. So all of those, it's going to be quite the battle. This is very unusual. It is not normal to charge an actor like this. The person, Alec Baldwin, had done a lot of things to try to make sure he didn't have a cold gun. There were numerous people on the set besides him who were in charge. So it is very unusual to charge him for this being involuntary manslaughter. I can only imagine how terrible all of the people on the set feel. It had to have been an unbelievably traumatic event for everyone, and that would definitely include Alec Baldwin. And it was a tragedy for Helena Hutchins' family, of course. So this is going to be something that's going to play out over months to come. Be sure to like the video and subscribe. I'm going to look through real quickly to see if there are any questions that y'all have. Yeah, the FBI is going to say he would have had to pull the trigger. Sure. I mean, I think just about any expert. This is going to be fairly easy for the prosecution. They're going to pull an expert in who says, yes, I looked at the gun. The gun was in completely normal shape. I attempted to fire it. It fired normally. It only fired when you use the trigger. Here are some videos of me pulling back the cocking mechanism. You can see that the gun isn't firing. And the thing about it is, it wasn't even necessary for Alec Baldwin to have made that argument. That was sort of the kind of thing where he made that argument and he didn't have to. So he hurt himself, shot himself in the foot, if you'll allow me to use the expression, without having any need to do that. He did not actually need to say what he said to George Stephanopoulos. And it will be used to prove, oh, he was lying and made all this up to try to escape responsibility. I doubt it was even that far. I imagine he went over it 1,000 times in his head. He could not conceive of having pulled the trigger. And so this is how it came out in his head. That's just my guess. But he did hurt himself with those two things. Was using a gun on the set necessary? Huge question. I can't imagine that using a real gun was truly necessary. If you've ever seen some of those airsoft guns, they are very realistic looking. It seems to me someone could clearly use that without having to use a real gun and get much the same effect. Even the weight of it. Those can be pretty heavy guns. So it seems to me like certainly if they've done this in the past, it ought to be changed. And the way the movie industry handles this ought to change. They shouldn't be using real guns that can shoot real bullets. That's just my opinion. But I imagine that that is an opinion that will be widely agreed to across the Hollywood boards, because they don't ever want to be in a position like that ever again. So be sure to like the video. Be sure to subscribe. I'd love to see you back in more for more videos, and I'll see you in the next one.